In 2022, Paul Goldschmidt was named the National League's most valuable player. But thanks to a mixture of current analytics, positional disadvantages, and voter biases, he may very well be the last first baseman to ever win the award. Let me explain. Prior to this year, the last time a first baseman won the MVP award in a full season was Joey Votto in 2010. That means it has now been 12 years since the last time a first baseman won the award. And before you type out your comments, yes, I am fully aware that 2 first basemen won the award in 2020. And trust me, I'll address Freddie and Jose later. But for now, just stick with me. What makes this 12-year gap so abnormal is that prior to 2010, first basemen practically dominated the award. Between 1991 and 2010, there were 40 MVP awards handed out across the National and American Leagues. Of those 40 awards, 11 of them were given out to first basemen. And this stretch featured 2 separate seasons where first basemen swept the awards. Frank Thomas and Jeff Bagwell in 1994, and Ryan Howard and Justin Morneau in 2006. And it's not like there's been a shortage of MVP caliber talent at the position either. Between the likes of Joey Votto, Freddie Freeman, Vladimir Guerrero Jr., and the aforementioned Goldschmidt, there have been plenty of seasons worthy of the crown over the past decade. So why is it that MVP voters don't look at first baseman the same way anymore? Well, it probably started with Miguel Cabrera's first MVP in 2012. Considering he was the first player in 45 years to win the Triple Crown, it was all but a given that Cabrera was going to be named MVP. However, his victory was nowhere near as definitive as it would have been in any other year. And the reason for that was a young rookie by the name of Mike Trout. At just 19 years old, Trout had taken the league by storm with his electric play. And while he may not have beaten Cabrera in any of the Triple Crown stats, he led the league in a much more important but far less known statistic. All around the game, there was a small but vocal minority of people who pointed out that even though Cabrera led in home runs, RBI, and batting average, Trout's overall performance gave his team much more value. The crux of this argument was based around a metric called WAR, or wins above replacement, that measured the total value of a player's performance compared to a replacement-level player at that position. And in this specific circumstance, Trout was more valuable than Cabrera by nearly 3 wins. At the time, the concept of WAR had been around for a while, but mostly around sabermetric circles. However, the discourse surrounding Trout and Cabrera pushed the stat into the mainstream for the first time. And by the time Trout won his first MVP award in 2014, WAR had become the de facto measurement of choice to measure a player's total value. And by extension, WAR totals became the main gatekeeper for any player's MVP campaign. In a way, that 2012 MVP race is a perfect encapsulation of how the MVP race has changed over time. Prior to that season, MVP was basically an award given to whoever had the best combination of average, homers, and RBI. And since the prevailing strategy was to put your biggest sluggers at first base, that player tended to be a first baseman more often than not. Think Ryan Howard, Jason Giambi, Frank Thomas, and Albert Pujols, just to name a few. However, the rise of Trout helped to usher in a new era of how we think about MVP voting, one that puts more emphasis on a player's total contributions instead of just his Triple Crown stats. This is what has made it so difficult for first basemen to rise above the rest of their peers over the last decade or so. But to understand why, we have to talk about why WAR doesn't really like first basemen. Basically, WAR is made up of 2 main components: runs created on offense and runs saved on defense. But the way both of these are calculated make it very, very difficult for a first baseman to put up a big WAR total. First, let's talk about offense. Unlike traditional offensive metrics, the offensive part of WAR takes into account more than just what happens during the player's at-bats. In addition to the value of a player's production at the plate, WAR also takes into account runs created on the base paths. Whereas first basemen used to be measured on their ability to slug at the plate and drive in runs, they were now expected to be productive on the base paths as well. And because they're usually the biggest and slowest players on the team, they typically don't fare very well in this regard. They don't steal bases, they don't have the speed to take the extra base, and that lack of speed makes it easier for them to hit into double plays, all of which negatively impact their WAR. And while base running may not seem like that big of a deal, these little things add up in value over the course of a full season. For an example, let's compare Yandy Diaz of the Rays with rookie sensation Julio Rodriguez. In 2022, both players had almost exactly the same number of plate appearances, and in those plate appearances, they created the same amount of runs at the plate. But the key difference between the two was that Julio stole 25 bases, while Yandy stole just 3. And while Julio created 4 runs on the base paths, Yandy actually cost his team 5 runs. As such, Julio is worth 10 more runs than Yandy on offense this season according to Fangraphs, which is roughly equal to a full win in terms of value. But base running isn't the main thing that's killing a first baseman's value. That's actually defense. One of the key components of WAR is something called the defensive adjustment, and it's what allows us to directly compare the value of players at different positions. As the name suggests, it adjusts a player's defensive value up or down based on how important defense is at that position. So if you play a defensive-minded position like shortstop, you get a huge boost to your value, typically around 10 runs for a full season. But if you play first base, the position where defense matters the least, you are actually penalized by about 10 runs. For those of you keeping track at home, that is nearly 2 wins worth of value that a first baseman has to make up just to be on the same level as a shortstop over the same number of games in a full season. And this ties into why 2 first basemen won the award in the shortened 2020 season. You see, the defensive adjustment actually changes based on the number of games you play, meaning that the more games you play, the more your value is enhanced or handicapped by the defensive adjustment. Thus, in a 60-game season, the penalty for playing first base is much smaller, and other positions have less of an advantage. And since things were on a much more even playing field, first basemen like Freddie Freeman and Jose Abreu were able to compete with shortstops like Fernando Tatis Jr. on the WAR leaderboards. So when I didn't include them earlier, it's not because I don't think their MVPs are valid, it's because with the way WAR is calculated, those leaderboards would have looked much different over the course of a full season. And realistically, the MVP debates would have looked much different as well. So considering that WAR is here to stay and that there won't be any major adjustments anytime soon, is it possible for another first baseman to rise above their disadvantages and win MVP? Theoretically, it's possible, but it would take a ton of things to go their way at once to make it happen. First, they would probably need to be historically good on defense to make up for the defensive adjustment, and be at least average on the base paths to avoid an offensive deduction. And if they can't do that, they would then have to be otherworldly on offense to compensate. Second, they would still have to hope that they don't run into an exceptional season from a player with a positive defensive adjustment, such as a shortstop or a center fielder, or in Vlad Jr.'s case, going up against 2021 Shohei Ohtani. And even if all of that goes their way, all of that work probably won't mean anything if their team doesn't make the playoffs, because for some reason, we still conflate an individual player's value with team success. And all of that isn't even getting into the politics and beliefs among the MVP voters themselves. In other words, first basemen in today's game face a gauntlet of statistical gatekeeping, positional disadvantages, and voter politics in order to win baseball's biggest individual prize. And given all of these factors happening at once, it's really no surprise that a first baseman hasn't won the award in over a decade now. In many ways, Goldschmidt's 2022 was as close as you could get to checking off all the boxes. He was well above average on the base paths, and his insane offensive output more than made up for the defensive adjustment, as he was 20 percentage points better than the second best hitter in the National League. Additionally, his team won their division, and he didn't have to compete against a player having a generational season. Even then, he still finished third in the league in F-WAR, and his victory was far from unanimous. So while it's certainly possible for another first baseman to rise above their disadvantages and take home the hardware, it is going to be incredibly difficult for them to do so. And it's going to take a combination of superhuman effort and incredible luck to make it happen. And if you're interested in learning more about how war has changed the nature of MVP voting, you should check out this video right here about how Mike Trout has changed the game of baseball forever. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.